You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tim Eckott, and today I'm in conversation with the author Anthony Horowitz. A prolific screenwriter and novelist, he's had particular success with his fictional series recounting the adventures of Alex Rider. Alex Rider is a teenage spy, something of a junior James Bond. After 9 Alex Rider novels, Anthony Horowitz has now written a prequel called Russian Roulette, partially set in Russia and detailing the origins of the assassin called Yasen Grigorovich. Yasen grows up in post-Soviet Russia and is recruited by a shadowy organisation called Scorpia. I wondered what drew Anthony Horowitz to writing his new story from the point of view of a trained killer.
Well, I'd come across his character in 4 or 5 of the books. I created him for the first time in Stormbreaker, where I just needed a sort of a catch-all assassin to turn up in the book, and that was the very beginning of it, and I didn't really have any thoughts about who or what he might be. But then he turned up again in, I think it was Eagle Strike, and again in Scorpia, and then yet again in Crocodile Tears. And as I wrote the character, I became more and more interested in him, what he was. I mean, you see killers in films and killers in television, and they turn up and they kill. But no one has ever asked the question as to what their origins are, and particularly in the world of children's literature. I thought that was interesting because children's books have a very simple template, which is that the central character is good. Harry Potter may lose his parents, he may be treated very roughly by the Dursleys, he may have an unhappy childhood, but he finds his calling and he becomes the hero. And this is the same for Percy Jackson, for Alex Rider, for all the heroes. But I began to think, what happens if it goes wrong? What happens if that process is interrupted by malign forces? What stops these characters from becoming evil? And at the same time, it occurred to me that nobody had ever written a book for young people that actually featured as its central character somebody who was seriously and unremittingly bad. And I'm not saying to somebody who has, a Persian cat on their lap and cackles, but somebody who really is a considered evil creation.
And as you mentioned, Harry Potter losing his parents, there seems to be this theme where the evil person is parentless, is without a family. That helps to form their sort of cold, mechanical nature, if you like. And you do that with Grigorovich, but you also empathise with him.
Well, there are 2 issues here, and the second one, if I may begin with it, the idea of empathising with the character. There is no point in reading a 400-page book and hating the main character. And I'm inviting the reader not necessarily to sympathise or to like Yasen, but certainly to understand him, to see him as a full human being and to say, well, actually, that could have happened to me in the same circumstances. As to the other point of losing parents, I mean, that is a trope you find in a great deal of children's literature. But normally it's done simply to give your character the freedom and independence to become a hero, a child who is at home and who's being told to go to bed at sort of 8 o'clock in the evening and to do his homework and to have you washed behind your ears and all that sort of stuff, can't really be a world-saving hero, or at least it might be interesting to try. In Yasen Grigorovich, I want you to think much more about what losing parents at the age of 14, particularly in very violent circumstances, would be like, and how it is the first step on the journey, not, as you suggest, to making him evil, because actually he doesn't become evil until much later in the book, and it's quite separate circumstances that do that to him.
But it also plays into something else which is important in fiction, particularly for young people, isn't it? That the hero is very much on their own, and teenagers particularly will identify with that.
I've always been fascinated by that period in your life, age about 13 to 15, where you're not a child anymore because you don't really need to be looked after as much as you did, but nor are you quite an adult, nor are you quite ready yet for the adult world. And that age, I think, is a very interesting one to deal with. And I think that it's more interesting if you take the child out of his comfort zone or her comfort zone and throw them to the wolves, so that they really do have to find all their inner strengths and inner ambitions and inner energy to survive.
Let's talk a little bit about the Russian angle here. The book is called Russian Roulette. Yasen Grigorovich is, of course, Russian. What is it about Russia that inspires authors to make them the baddies?
Well, I suppose it's growing up with James Bond is the beginning of it. I mean, that would have to be it. Sort of Rosa Klebb and Grant Donovan and From Russia with Love, of course. When I created Yasen, therefore, it seemed obvious to make him Russian. I wanted to give him just sort of something exotic. And as I said to you at the beginning of this discussion, I didn't really think of him as a serious character at that time. So he was very much the pantomime Russian, sleek ballet dancer looks. It was only later that I began to think about him in less, dare I say it, racist terms and to humanize him. So that the original decision was just my own childhood and shorthand, but in the end I was very glad I did, because it allowed me to explore a very, very interesting country at, I think, a fascinating time.
You mentioned the Cold War, and of course, the majority of your readers born after the Cold War ended, and indeed in the era when Russia is no longer Soviet or communist. Does that worry you that authors like yourself are relying on those slightly stereotypical views of what Russia represents and still regard it as a rich mine or a vein for finding their villains?
Well, I don't think what I wrote was stereotypical in the end, because first of all, I wasn't writing about 1946, and Yasin is a character who is born much, much later, a few years, 10 years or so before the wall comes down. I went through the Berlin Wall when it was, Checkpoint Charlie and all that, and I went into Eastern Europe when it was part of the communist bloc. And I do have memories of all that, but I made a decision very quickly, but I wasn't going to write about that time. The time in the Alex Rider books, incidentally, is fluid. I never say that anything happens at a specific time, which gives me the freedom to choose what year I'm writing about. And I very quickly decided that the Russia, the Soviet Union, before Gorbachev, before the wall came down, was not something I wanted to write about, because it would be outside and alien to young people's experience. They wouldn't know what on earth I was going on about. And I don't write history lessons, I write adventures. So I came up with a period sort of 1999, the sort of end of Yeltsin, the beginning of Putin, and the sort of the extraordinary years at the beginning of the 2000s up to 2005, when Russia went through this really fast and extraordinary change, as the new system was taken on board and the whole country changed. And it seems to me, and I don't really know, but it seems to me that in that period, pretty much everything of the old Russia disappeared. I mean, it's very, very hard now to trace what even Moscow was like at that time, because the buildings have been torn down, there's been new programs of development, and obviously, people are much wealthier now, and life is completely different. Now, I spoke to a lot of Russians who grew up in that period, who were the same age as Yasin at the same time, and a lot of their memories are in that book. I do that quite often in my work. But even so, I know that what I have stitched together is, to a certain extent, a fabrication. It is a sort of or better a word for it might be an amalgamation. It is an amalgamation of all sorts of different events at different times put into one short life.
Does it worry you, though, that you may be presenting a slightly obvious take on Russia by making the baddie the Russian and the assassin? I mean, as you say, there's a lot of picking up on the James Bond scenarios, the mentality. Is it time for authors to move on and find another evil empire?
Well, first of all, the main villain in the book may be Russian, but there's a secondary villain who is just as bad, and she's Welsh. So it's not entirely anti-Russian, this book. In fact, it's not anti-Russian at all in any sense of the word. As to your question of, is it time for writers to move on? It might be time for other writers to move on, but I'm perfectly happy where I am. I am writing adventure stories. I'm not writing politics. I'm not writing anything that is particularly educational, and I don't think that a child reading Russian roulette is going to come out and say, oh my goodness, Russia's a horrible place, I wouldn't want to go there, because that's not the message of the book. When I write, I'm always writing about young people who are thrown into an adult world. It can be Europe, it could be America, it can be Russia, and they often find themselves up against very, very unpleasant, deceitful, and manipulative people. I mean, even Alex's bosses in England, the MI5, are not portrayed like M in the James Bond books. They're very much more the sort of the secret intelligence that betrayed us over Iraq. So, to that extent, I am moving on.
Tell me a little bit about this concept of Alex Rider, and in this new book, Russian Roulette, Yasin Grigorovich. What do you think it is about you that makes you able to inhabit the mind of the 14-year-old boy so successfully?
I think that I remember being 14. I think it's a feat of memory rather than anything else. I wasn't a particularly happy 14-year-old. I had been sent to a very horrible school. I had a slightly strange and not entirely satisfactory family, a very wealthy one, incidentally. I can't complain about my childhood. I was very well looked after and very privileged in every sense. But I wasn't happy. And I think that this has made something stick in my mind about the nature of boyhood, the nature of being a child, that I still express in my books. A sense of trying to escape from what I was and from where I was, from parents who I didn't really understand. I found my refuge when I was at that age in books and in stories and in writing stories and in telling stories at school. I was the school storyteller in a dormitory late at night. I'd tell stories to the other boys to keep morale up, you might say. And that just hasn't left. I don't think I am particularly in the mind of children, as you put it.
I meant, what is it that makes you empathise, perhaps, with that age? I mean, is it the age at which one's personality is first set in concrete, or is it the most... Do you think it's a truly significant age in terms of the man you become?
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's what I was saying earlier, that particular window in your life between 13 and 15, which is, it's slightly, just before sex comes in and all the matters that all the problem to that brings and the sort of the pleasures of it, obviously, but also sort of the weight of it. It's before adult responsibilities have arrived, but at the same time, it is after you've sort of begun to leave toys and some of your childhood imaginings behind you. I don't see children like your own son as being, little kids that need to have books written specially for them. My books are adult books, but they happen to be about that peculiar period, 13 to 15, in young people's lives.
You write in a way which is particularly accessible to boys of that age. Do you feel you've aged much since you were 14, or do you still feel, in some senses, that age?
I look in the mirror sometimes and I see this 57-year-old man, and I know that my 14-year-old self would be absolutely shocked. I mean, disgusted, shocked, upset. The notion that I would be the age that I am now never really occurred to me as a sort of a teenager, and I was slightly horrified by it, and I still am. Really, I find old age, by and large, depressing. I mean, there's not much good to be said about it. I try not to let that creep into my writing. I try to make the writing as fresh as when I was a 20-year-old writing. And in a funny way, I think that is something in which I have succeeded. I think that the books are better than they were. They're stronger, they're more thoughtful. But at the end of the day, I write with the same excitement and passion and pleasure and sort of anticipation that I did when I was very young. Nothing has changed in my writing.
You mentioned that your own boyhood of that sort of age, 13, 14, was not particularly happy. What was the salient unhappy factor for you?
Well, it was very remote parents. I mean, a father who was a businessman who never really told me what he did, who was very aloof, a strange man, not a bad man in any respect. I mean, I'm sure a very good man. He gave me a very good education and, he brought me up as a rather spoiled child, to be honest with you. So he would be, I think, disappointed to hear me on the radio now criticising him. But nonetheless, I mean, he did ridicule the idea that I wanted to be a writer and thought me stupid and thought me inconsequential, and sent me to a school when I was 8 years old, which was a truly brutal place. I mean, I've spoken about it often, a place called Orley Farm in North London. They wrote to me recently to make it clear that they're not the same anymore, so I should perhaps mention that before I hear from their lawyers. But back in the sort of 60s, it was a dreadful, destructive place, which did me a great deal of harm, and I think I live with that harm to this day. And I was a very unhealthy child. I was very overweight. I didn't really find myself as a writer until I was about sort of 16, 17. And I took off when I was 18 and travelled the world and tried to sort of build into myself values that were outside the experience I'd had so far. And then I went to university and then I got published, etc., etc. So the childhood was just a bad start. It was a bad start, but at the same time, if you ask me, would I swap it now? Would I go back and have a different childhood? Since I think it fueled so much of my writing, the answer is probably not. I mean, it's whenever I sit down at my desk and whenever I, bring my laptop or my pen towards me, I'm back there and I'm fighting the same forces that created me.
So you wouldn't be the person you are now or the writer you became had it not been for that rather gruesome school experience?
School and family and upbringing generally was definitely unhealthy. I was lucky in that I met my wife, Jill, and we've been married for 25 years and we have 2 children and we have a very normal, very happy family, I think. And that was the saving of me in many respects. But, I'm news about this. I don't like to talk about it so much because I know that there are people out there in the world who have really unhappy childhoods and who have nothing to eat and who have nothing to drink and who have, maybe have lost their parents, but who might sit here and listen to this and say, what is this oaf complaining about? Give me that education and that sort of privilege. But nonetheless, we're hot-wired in all sorts of ways as human beings. Unhappiness has many different sorts of forms, and it may not always be that poverty, disability, and all the other things which I know are higher up on the Richter scale than what I'm complaining about, but they can be just as damaging.
You mentioned you're a father now yourself. Do you reference that relationship with your own father when it comes to dealing with your own children? Do you think, I don't want to be like him, or I must make an effort to put my head in the place where my child's head is? Do you do that consciously, or is that asking too much?
Listen, I know perfectly well that I'm by far not a perfect father, and I'm quite certain that one or other of my sons will find himself in this studio in 20 years' time saying terrible things about me. I mean, we all make mistakes as parents. My favourite poem is the Philip Larkin one. You know, they muck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. The word muck I have changed for your listeners. I think that I have done my best to be a different sort of father and a different sort of parent to my parents, just to be more open, to be there for them, to support them in whatever they want to do, to encourage them, to let them know what I do, to involve them in my world more. That's not just because I am cleverer than they are. I think that society has changed so much in my lifetime that the generation that's growing up now has a totally different attitude to adults than I did. You know, the fact that all my kids' friends call me Anthony. That wouldn't have happened when I was a boy. I mean, it was always Mr. or Mrs. whatever. But now even my son calls me Anthony, actually, which is sort of unusual. But I like that. I think it's great that I can sit at a table with 10, 20-year-olds who are my son's friends who are gathered, and I'm not the sort of the codger in the corner. And that's an attitudinal change that I think is generational. It's not just my family. I see it everywhere, and I think it's one of the great things about the sort of times we live in now.
It's also a function of the changes in education, isn't it? Because, I mean, the boyhood you described, without going into the specifics, that was a not uncommon experience to be in a rather brutal environment, totally different to what our children have experienced in terms of the attitude and the kindness that teachers show. It's a very much more nurturing environment, isn't it?
Well, I did have 3 wonderful teachers at my secondary school who did encourage me to become a writer and to read and to immerse myself in literature, and they did change my life. You know, I always say that a bad teacher spoils your day, a good teacher makes your life, and that happened to me. Yes, education has obviously changed, and people of our age do remember things that would now be illegal. I mean, you know, flogging a child, or beating him around the head in a classroom with a book or with the back of your hand or with a ruler. Some of the sort of the slimier and more seedy aspects of some of those teachers at that time would put them in prison now, as simply as that. And it's wonderful that the pendulum has swung and these things are now behind them. And I do, in some respects, envy modern children who have so many benefits that we didn't have. I mean, technologically and in terms of sort of how society treats them.
But do you think they're too cosseted? Some people say they're becoming weakened.
I was going to come on to that now. I was going to come on to that and say that there is a danger, however, that it goes too far, and we are now seeing that you talked about the kindness of teachers, but if a teacher reaches out and touches a child, in some circumstances that can cause all sorts of troubles, and that shouldn't be the case. I don't think teachers should live in fear of being misunderstood or misinterpreted in class, and I blame a great deal of that on the legislation that was brought in by the Labour government over 13 years that sought to undermine the relationship between adults and children by tarring every single adult as a potential paedophile and every single child as a potential victim, and we're still living with the consequences of that.
Why has that fear taken hold? I mean, particularly in Britain, it seems.
Well, it's a combination of things. I'm not sure I entirely know the answer to that question, but I would say that certainly media hysteria haven't helped, campaigns against paedophiles and that sort of thing, and the sense that these days you can be denounced as a paedophile quite publicly and openly, and then only 6 months later, after a long court battle, are you allowed a couple of inches in the back of a newspaper to say actually it wasn't true. That doesn't help. I think also the amount of legislation that we've brought in, inheriting it from America, with lawyers always on the lookout now for opportunities to sue different sorts of people for different sorts of problems, and the gradual move of society where it is no longer the family that has responsibility, but the teachers and government and any body in authority that has the responsibility for the upbringing of your child. I think that is all unhealthy and such. But at the same time, it's a fast-changing world, and what do I know? You know, people of my age always look around them and say, oh dear, this isn't too good. You know, when I was a child, it was much easier, much better, and I think one has to guard against that too. The world is changing in ways that I may not approve, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is changing for the worse.
Is the world a better place now than it was 40 years ago when you were at school?
Undoubtedly. The world always improves. It's only people get old and they don't really understand the world anymore and they assume it's got worse. But I think in terms of technology, in terms of medicine and science and social cohesion and peace, the world is an immeasurably better place. I mean, you know, when I was born, I think rationing was still in place in the Second World War, or maybe it had stopped the year before, but it was, you know, it is very tempting and easy to look around you and say, oh, it's all catastrophe, it's all disaster. But it isn't. Of course it's better, and will continue to get better.
A lot of people get to a certain age, shall we say 50 odd, and they start lamenting a decline in standards. Are you ever tempted to do that?
I do. I mean, I'll give you a very good example. Turbines, wind turbines. I look at them on the coast off Orford and on the hills around me, and I lament them and I hate them with every fibre of my being. I think they're monsters. I've even written a song about them for a Benjamin Britten competition, Monsters of the Deep, I called it, and it's about wind turbines. And if you ask me in an interview at any time, I'll say they're wasteful, they're horrible, they're stupid, they're destroying the countryside. Ask my son, and he says, what's the fuss? He says, I think they're quite nice, actually. I quite like the look of them. And I say, well, hold on, they're chopping up birds. Well, what does that matter? A few birds gone, what do we care? So in that, you just have the answer to your question, which is that we look around us with horror, and I still think that wind turbines are vile, but the next generation doesn't agree with me. And unfortunately, the next generation now owns the world, not me. And I think that's what you have to acknowledge when you make your criticisms. And it's the same thing whether it's apostrophes or table manners or eating McDonald's instead of eating your mother's home-cooked roast lamb with 3 veg, whatever. Life changes. And it's only we, from our position, who decide that it's getting worse. The young people who are inheriting it all are perfectly happy with it the way it now is.
As a writer, though, don't you feel that there are standards that must be maintained in order for literature to improve and survive?
Well, yes, but literature will improve and survive, no matter how many people forget their apostrophe or write gonna instead of going to.
Well, how many people are reading is the real question, I suppose. Are you fearful that young people are losing the habit of reading?
No, I don't think that for a minute. I mean, I look at my own sales, and I know how many books I'm selling, and I know how popular the books are amongst young people. I think it's more worrying that reading isolates groups. I mean, in the South, in the leafy suburbs, largely white children who are well off. The elephant in the room is this whole question of reading and class and reading and privilege and reading belonging to a minority. And with the Alex Rider books, I'm always hoping I can reach out to schools that aren't reading and to areas where books are more alien. But I can't.
Is it really a class thing, though? I mean, there's obviously an element of that. The statistics coming out seem to show that fewer and fewer young people, particularly of the Alex Rider generation, if you like, are in the habit of reading for pleasure. It seems to be a smaller number, even of middle-class children.
Look, there is a problem. There is definitely an issue. Education has made a mistake. Again, this is now pontificating like an old man, which is what I said I didn't want to do, but you were forcing me into it. I believe that schools should have libraries. Every single school, by statute, should have a library and a librarian, a full-time librarian. It is the core, the heart of education. I believe schools should have reading periods. Now, this is, again, talking about my type of education, growing up as a boy. I do believe that schools should have silent reading times and shared texts in schools. If everybody in the school reads the same book, then everybody in the same school has something in common. These are just obvious points to make. And I think that the national curriculum has squeezed this out, that education has become far too much about attainment and about career and about earnings, and far too little about what education really is, which is knowing yourself, discovering yourself, and enjoying yourself. But the second part of that is, let's imagine a world 100 years into the future where nobody reads anything anymore. Who am I to say that is a worse world than the one we're in now? It's certainly not a world I would be comfortable in or happy in. I think it'd be a world that would have a huge hole in its heart, and it's almost unimaginable for me to imagine a life without books. It's just, they're so important to me. But I think that there is a difference between sharing that enthusiasm in my work, writing the books, and in my crusading, going around banging on about libraries and saying to kids, come in and read this and look at that, and sort of sitting on a soapbox and saying, the world is getting worse because fewer children are reading.
There seems to be a sense amongst people who love books that the habit of reading is going out of fashion, or it's becoming a minority habit. And it seems to be getting harder for educationalists to interest children in reading for pleasure because they have so many other distractions, and the screen and the keyboard are more tempting, particularly for boys.
But the screen brings books into the house. I mean, now you can get a book at the touch of a button. It's amazing. My books, you don't have to go to a bookshop anymore. One key and it's downloaded in 5 seconds. That's a miracle. I wrote an article last year saying that every child in this country should have an e-reader. That when you go to school, the first thing you should have when you go through the door is an e-reader. It seems so blindingly obvious to me. But that way you can put Dickens and Austen but not only the classics, which is what Michael Gove wants children to read, but my books and Rowling and Pullman and anybody else into the hands of children as they leave the building. All we can do as the older generation is share our enthusiasms, is to promote what we believe in. But we have to do it from the point of view of this is wonderful and we love it, not this is good for you and you're going to be worse than us if you don't.
Do you like children?
God, do I like children? Well, yes. I mean, no, I don't love children. I mean, I don't like children per se. I mean, I think to answer yes to your question would these days would seem slightly suspect, actually. I mean, there are young people that I meet whom I like very much, but since most of the young people I meet are fans of my books, I wouldn't I? And I do, I find youth and sort of the aspirations of youth. I've never had the negativity that you find in the British press about young people. I haven't forgotten, as I said, what it was like to be young myself. I have 2 sons whom I like very much. I like their friends very much. But I'm not particularly drawn to children. And half my work, at the very least, is adult. I'm writing adult novels now. I've written Foyle's War for 13 years, and that's adult television.
How much of a switch, then, is that in your head as a writer?
That's the point. There is no switch. I write stories. I write very fast-paced adventure, twisting, unpredictable, hopefully exciting, and since you mentioned it, I hope also quite well-written books. I don't really sit down and say, oh, this one's for children or this one's for adults. I mean, and I think to do so would be the undoing of me because the book is the thing. And I don't think there's anything in Russian roulette that you wouldn't enjoy or that you would find patronizing. I mean, the book is entirely adult, except for the fact that it has a 14-year-old protagonist, although he's 19 by the end of the book. Indeed, he's in his late 20s by the very end of it. There is no sex in the book. I suppose that might differentiate it, but then there's no sex in all of Sherlock Holmes, and that doesn't make that a children's book.
And finally, Anthony, you've been generous with your time, but have we heard the last of Alex Rider himself?
I have a plan to publish some of the short pieces about Alex Rider that have been published over the years. There are about 4 or 5 little short stories, and to that I'll add a couple of novellas that might just answer a few questions about Alex. But I always thought that I would only do a certain number of books, that I would keep it finite, because it's so easy as a writer, particularly one who's been writing for as long as me, to just write the book that you know is going to be the bestseller, the one that is a certain sell, the one that everybody wants. And that's an Alex Rider book. But there are other things I want to write, and I think that writing is an adventure, and I want it to be unpredictable and exciting, so I don't have any particular plans to return to Alex, although that all said, who knows?
Is your head completely full of stories? Have you got an endless conveyor belt there of plots that you're waiting to get into?
Another way of putting that question is, do you have a life? I do have a life. I have a very happy life, but it is true that I am driven by story. I love story. I love thinking up ideas, and I'm already 2/3 of the way through my next book. The one after that is planned. I have a trilogy for young people, which I hope to write or start writing in a year or two's time. I have books in my head that will take me through to the next decade. That's just the way I am.
You've been listening to In Conversation on The Voice of Russia. I'm Tim Eckott, and my guest was the author Anthony Horowitz. His latest novel is called Russian Roulette, published by Walker Books.
Would be like and how it is the first step on the journey, not as you suggest to making him evil, because actually he doesn't become evil until much later in the book, and it's quite separate circumstances that do that to him.
But it also plays into something else which is important in fiction, particularly for young people, isn't it? That the hero is very much on their own, and teenagers particularly will identify with that.
I've always been fascinated by that period in your life, age about 13 to 15, where you're not a child anymore because you don't really need to be looked after as much as you did, but nor are you quite an adult, nor are you quite ready yet for the adult world. And that age, I think, is a very interesting one to deal with. And I think that it's more interesting if you take the child out of his comfort zone or her comfort zone and throw them to the wolves, so that they really do have to find all their inner strengths and inner ambitions and inner energy to survive.
Let's talk a little bit about the Russian angle here. The book is called Russian Roulette. Yasen Grigorovich is, of course, Russian. What is it about Russia that inspires authors to make them the baddies?
Well, I suppose it's growing up with James Bond is the beginning of it. I mean, that would have to be it. Sort of Rosa Klebb and Grant Donovan and From Russia with Love, of course. When I created Yasin, therefore, it seemed obvious to make him Russian. I wanted to give him just sort of something exotic. And as I said to you at the beginning of this discussion, I didn't really think of him as a serious character at that time. So he was very much the pantomime Russian, sleek ballet dancer looks. It was only later that I began to think about him in less, dare I say it, racist terms and to humanize him. So that the original decision was just my own childhood and shorthand, but in the end I was very glad I did, because it allowed me to explore a very, very interesting country at, I think, a fascinating time.
You mentioned the Cold War, and of course, the majority of your readers born after the Cold War ended, and indeed in the era when Russia is no longer Soviet or communist. Does that worry you that authors like yourself are relying on those slightly stereotypical views of what Russia represents and still regard it as a rich mine or a vein for finding their villains?
Well, I don't think what I wrote was stereotypical in the end, because first of all, I wasn't writing about 1946, and Yasin is a character who is born much, much later.
To be this theme where the evil person is parentless, is without a family, that helps to form their sort of cold, mechanical nature, if you like. And you do that with Grigorovich, but you also empathize with him.
Well, there are two issues here, and a second one, if I may begin with it, the idea of empathizing with the character. There is no point in reading a 400-page book and hating the main character. And I'm inviting the reader not necessarily to sympathize or to like Yasin, but certainly to understand him, to see him as a full human being and to say, well, actually, that could have happened to me in the same circumstances. As to the other point of losing parents, I mean, that is a trope you find in a great deal of children's literature. But normally it's done simply to give your character the freedom and independence to become a hero, a child who is at home and who's being told to go to bed at sort of 8 o'clock in the evening and to do his homework and to have you washed behind your ears and all that sort of stuff, can't really be a world-saving hero, or at least it might be interesting to try. In Yasin Grigorovich, I wanted to think much more about what losing parents at the age of 14, particularly in very violent circumstances, crocodile tears. And as I wrote the character, I became more and more interested in him, what he was. I mean, you see killers in films and killers in television, and they turn up and they kill. But no one has ever asked the question as to what their origins are, and particularly in the world of children's literature. I thought that was interesting because children's books have a very simple template, which is that the central character is good. Harry Potter may lose his parents, he may be treated very roughly by the Dursleys, he may have an unhappy childhood, but he finds his calling and he becomes the hero. And this is the same for Percy Jackson, for Alex Rider, for all the heroes. But I began to think, what happens if it goes wrong? What happens if that process is interrupted by malign forces? What stops these characters from becoming evil? And at the same time, it occurred to me that nobody had ever written a book for young people that actually featured as its central character somebody who was seriously and unremittingly bad. And I'm not saying to somebody who has, a Persian cat on their lap and cackles, but somebody who really is a considered evil creation.
And as you mentioned, Harry Potter losing his parents, there seems to... You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tim Eckert, and today I'm in conversation with the author Anthony Horowitz. A prolific screenwriter and novelist, he's had particular success with his fictional series recounting the adventures of Alex Rider. Alex Rider is a teenage spy, something of a junior James Bond. After 9 Alex Rider novels, Anthony Horowitz has now written a prequel called Russian Roulette, partially set in Russia and detailing the origins of the assassin called Yasin Grigorovich. Yasin grows up in post-Soviet Russia and is recruited by a shadowy organization called Scorpia. I wondered what drew Anthony Horowitz to writing his new story from the point of view of a trained killer.
Well, I'd come across his character in 4 or 5 of the books. I created him for the first time in Stormbreaker, where I just needed a sort of a catch-all assassin to turn up in the book, and that was the very beginning of it, and I didn't really have any thoughts about who or what he might be, but then he turned up again in, I think it was Eagle Strike, and again in Scorpia, and then yet again in